August 6, 1942. The aircraft carrier Shokaku sat anchored in Truk Lagoon, its flight deck empty, its hangar bays unnaturally quiet. Below the waterline, cramped in a dimly lit conference room thick with cigarette smoke, 5 of Japan's most distinguished naval officers gathered around a table laden with maps, casualty reports, and intelligence summaries. They had been meeting for 3 hours. The silence had grown oppressive. No one had spoken for the last 10 minutes. Finally, Rear Admiral Tamon Yamaguchi broke through the stagnant air. "Gentlemen," he said quietly, his voice carrying the weight of mathematical certainty, "we need to acknowledge what these numbers are telling us. The war is lost." The room remained silent. No one contradicted him. No one had to. They all knew. Every officer in that compartment had reviewed the same intelligence assessments, studied the same production statistics, examined the same casualty figures. The conclusion was inescapable, written not in words but in numbers, cold, indisputable data that spelled defeat. August 6, 1942 marked exactly 2 months since the Battle of Midway, and the implications were finally becoming undeniable. Japan had lost the war's initiative, possibly forever. And the terrible irony was that Pearl Harbor, the attack that was supposed to eliminate American naval power and secure Japan's dominance in the Pacific, had instead guaranteed Japan's eventual and complete defeat. To understand how these admirals reached this devastating conclusion, we must travel back through time. We must go back 8 months to December 7, 1941, to the morning that changed everything. The attack that should have been victory. That morning, Admiral Isoroku Yamamoto's carefully planned strike achieved what Japanese military planners considered a tactical masterpiece. Japanese naval aircraft descended upon Pearl Harbor in 2 waves, executing a meticulously choreographed operation that caught the American fleet completely unprepared. The attack was executed with cold precision. Japanese pilots sank or damaged 8 American battleships, the USS Arizona, Oklahoma, West Virginia, California, Nevada, Tennessee, Maryland, and Pennsylvania. They destroyed 188 American military aircraft, most of them sitting vulnerable on the ground. Over 2,400 Americans were killed, many of them trapped below decks as their ships filled with seawater. The attack was executed almost perfectly, but immediately after the explosions faded, astute military observers began to notice something deeply troubling. The American aircraft carriers, Enterprise, Lexington, and Saratoga, were not in port. They were at sea, untouched, their flight decks intact, their aircraft fully operational and unharmed. This was the first critical failure, and in retrospect, it was catastrophic. Battleships, the weapon system that dominated naval thinking in the pre-war era, were not the true masters of the modern ocean. Aircraft carriers were. Japanese planners would pay dearly for this miscalculation. Beyond the missing carriers, other vital targets remained intact. The massive fuel storage facilities at Pearl Harbor, containing millions of gallons of precious oil, were not targeted. The submarine base sat untouched. The repair facilities and dry docks, the very installations that would prove crucial to American naval recovery, remained functional. The American forward bases would soon be humming with activity, repairing damaged vessels and preparing new ones for combat. Admiral Isoroku Yamamoto, the brilliant strategist who had conceived and planned the Pearl Harbor operation, supposedly reflected on the attack with remarkable prescience. The famous quote, "I fear all we have done is to awaken a sleeping giant and fill him with a terrible resolve," has become legendary. While historians continue to debate whether Yamamoto actually spoke these exact words, Japanese naval intelligence documents from early 1942 show that Japan's senior admirals absolutely understood what they had done. They had not achieved victory. They had triggered something far more dangerous: American determination. The narrowing window. Japanese naval intelligence estimates from early 1942 revealed a terrifying reality. Japan had a narrow window of opportunity, perhaps 6 to 8 months at most, before American industrial production would begin to overwhelm any Japanese advantages in training, experience, and tactical positioning. 8 months. By August 1942, that window had sealed shut. The Battle of Midway in early June 1942 was the catastrophic turning point. It arrived with mathematical inevitability, exactly as Admiral Yamamoto had feared it would. Japan lost 4 fleet carriers in a single day: the Akagi, Kaga, Soryu, and Hiryu. These were not merely ships. They were irreplaceable combat platforms crewed by some of the most highly trained pilots in the world. Japan had entered the war with 10 fleet carriers. By August 1942, they had 6 operational carriers, and 2 of those were damaged and out of action. The loss ratio alone was staggering. The United States had lost only 1 fleet carrier, the Yorktown, which would eventually be finished off by a Japanese submarine after being damaged in the battle. But Japan had lost 4, and not just any 4, but 4 of the 8 fleet carriers that had executed the Pearl Harbor raid. One of those, the Hiryu, included Admiral Tamon Yamaguchi in its death roll. When American bombers crippled his ship, Yamaguchi refused evacuation. He chose instead to go down with his vessel, a final act of defiance that would have been noble under other circumstances, but was simply the beginning of a cascading national disaster. The United States, meanwhile, was building new aircraft carriers at a pace that stunned and horrified Japanese naval planners. American shipyards had over a dozen Essex-class fleet carriers under construction. These were not merely quantitative improvements. They were qualitatively superior as well. The Essex-class carriers were larger, more heavily armed, more resistant to damage, and incorporated advanced features like improved anti-aircraft armament and expanded flight decks. The first of these formidable ships would enter service in early 1943. By 1944, the United States would achieve numerical superiority so overwhelming that the Japanese defensive strategy would become not merely improbable, but mathematically impossible to execute. But the aircraft carrier numbers, alarming as they were, represented only one dimension of Japan's catastrophic problem. The intelligence reports reviewed in that conference room on August 6th detailed American aircraft production figures that revealed the true scope of the industrial disparity. In 1941, American factories had produced approximately 19,000 military aircraft. Japanese factories had produced about 5,000. This represented a 3.8 to 1 disadvantage, already severe, but the trend was accelerating downward. American production was surging, reaching into the stratosphere through the application of mass production techniques that Japan simply could not match. By 1943, intelligence estimates suggested the United States would produce approximately 85,000 aircraft annually, more than 5 times what it had produced in 1941. Japan, by contrast, would produce perhaps 16,000 aircraft in 1943 if everything went perfectly, which it would not. The gap was not merely large, it was expanding at an exponential rate. To make the situation even more dire, American factories were achieving production speeds that Japanese planners found almost incomprehensible. At Douglas Aircraft's facility in California, American factories were producing military aircraft in days, a pace that Mitsubishi, Japan's largest aircraft manufacturer, could only achieve in weeks. A single American factory employed nearly 20% of Japan's entire aircraft workforce. The entire Japanese aircraft industry, spread across multiple companies, employed approximately 35,000 workers. A single American production facility employed roughly 7,000 workers. The pilot catastrophe captain Mitsuo Fuchida, the man who had led the air attack on Pearl Harbor and commanded the Japanese bombers as they descended toward the unprepared American fleet, was present in that August conference room. He had been wounded at Midway and was still recovering from his injuries, but his tactical expertise and intimate knowledge of naval aviation made him invaluable for strategic planning. Fuchida presented an analysis that devastated morale. It was not about ships, it was about pilots. Japanese naval aviation had begun the war with approximately 3,500 highly trained carrier pilots. These were not merely competent aviators. These men had trained for years, sometimes a decade or more, practicing the extraordinarily difficult skills required to take off from and land on moving carrier decks. They were widely considered the finest carrier pilots in the world in December 1941, the cream of the Imperial Japanese Navy. By August 1942, roughly 40% of them were dead. They had been killed at the Coral Sea, annihilated at Midway, and slowly ground down through the grinding attrition of the Solomon Islands campaign. The survivors were exhausted, flying multiple missions per day with inadequate rest and deteriorating aircraft. Their skills remained superior to their American counterparts, but the sheer rate of loss was unsustainable. Japanese pilot training programs were producing perhaps 100 new carrier-qualified pilots per month, a respectable number in isolation, but catastrophically insufficient when facing losses that were frequently 2 or 3 times that rate. Worse, these new pilots had perhaps 200 hours of flight time. The veterans they were attempting to replace had accumulated 800 or more hours of training before the war even began. The gulf in experience was almost unbridgeable. American pilot production told a completely different story. The United States was training thousands of pilots monthly with a system that, while not producing the masterful aviators with whom Japan had begun the war, was producing competent airmen at scales Japan could not comprehend. American pilots had progressively longer training pipelines. By 1944, American pilots being assigned to carrier squadrons would have at least 400 to 500 hours of flight time. By 1945, new American fighter pilots were receiving 525 hours of training time, compared to barely 40 hours for new Japanese Navy pilots. Moreover, American pilot policy was fundamentally different. The United States rotated experienced pilots back home to train new pilots. This meant that American veteran pilots survived and transferred their skills to the next generation. Japan, by contrast, kept its best pilots in combat until they were killed. Every experienced Japanese pilot lost was effectively irreplaceable. Over the course of the war, roughly 8,900 Japanese naval and military pilots would be killed in action, in accidents, or through operational losses. As American General George Kenney, commander of Allied air forces in the Pacific, would later observe, "Japan's originally highly trained crews were superb, but they are dead." Fuchida calculated that at current attrition rates, Japan would run out of experienced carrier pilots by mid-1943, regardless of how many carriers they had or how many new aircraft they could produce. The mathematics were inescapable. It was as if Japan had decided to fight a war with a finite supply of water, using it faster than it could be replenished. The strangling blockade, the submarine warfare statistics were equally grim. Japanese submarines had achieved minimal success despite their sophisticated designs and the dedication of their crews. They were used primarily for fleet support rather than commerce raiding, a fundamental strategic error that would cost Japan enormously. Meanwhile, American submarines were beginning to accomplish something unprecedented. They were systematically strangling Japanese merchant shipping. Japan's entire economy, indeed, Japan's entire war effort, depended entirely on imports: oil from the Dutch East Indies, rubber from Malaya, rice from Indochina, iron ore from multiple sources across occupied territories. All of it had to be shipped through waters increasingly dominated by American submarines. Admiral Tamon Yamaguchi presented the shipping loss statistics, and the trend lines were terrifying. In January 1942, Japan had lost 15 merchant ships. By June, the rate had climbed to 30 ships per month. By August, the monthly rate had increased to 40 merchant vessels. By 1943, the losses would accelerate further. 305 ships, totaling 1,335,000 tons, would be sunk in 1943 alone. By 1944, 565 merchant vessels totaling 2,180,000 tons would be sent to the bottom by American submarines. The total would eventually reach over 5 million tons of Japanese merchant shipping lost to American submarines alone. At current loss rates, by 1944, Japan would not have enough merchant shipping to maintain basic economic function, much less support military operations. The blockade was tightening. It was becoming a noose. Japan's shipbuilding capacity could produce perhaps 200,000 tons of merchant shipping per year. Japan was losing 300,000 tons per year, and the losses were accelerating. The mathematics were simple and brutal. Japan was running a deficit. Ships were being sent to the bottom faster than they could be replaced. The defensive perimeter problem. The strategic situation was equally dire. Japan had conquered vast territories in an astonishingly brief period of 6 months. The Philippines, Malaya, Singapore, the Dutch East Indies, Burma, and numerous Pacific islands fell to Japanese forces in rapid succession. This expansion created a defensive perimeter thousands of miles long. Defending it required dispersing Japanese forces across dozens of garrisons, many in isolated locations that were extraordinarily difficult to supply and essentially impossible to reinforce quickly. The Americans, by contrast, could concentrate their forces. They could choose where and when to attack. Japan had to defend everywhere, maintaining garrisons in hundreds of locations across millions of square miles of ocean. This fundamental asymmetry meant that even with equal forces, the Americans had an inherent advantage, but the forces were not equal. American strength was growing exponentially. Japanese strength was declining. The admirals discussed the situation in the Solomon Islands, where American forces had landed on Guadalcanal in early August 1942. The operation was just days old, but the implications were clear. This represented a new American strategy: seizing forward bases, building airfields, using those airfields to dominate surrounding areas, then advancing to the next target. It was methodical, grinding, and brutally effective. Japan could not match this approach. Japanese logistics were inadequate. The supply lines stretched across thousands of miles of ocean, vulnerable to American submarines and aircraft. Japanese industrial production couldn't provide enough aircraft, ships, and supplies to match American reinforcement rates. Every battle was becoming a battle of attrition, and Japan was losing the attrition calculus at every level in ships, in aircraft, in pilots, in supplies, in everything that mattered. The domestic front and American Resolve One admiral raised the possibility of negotiated peace. Perhaps if Japan proposed returning some conquered territories, the United States might agree to a ceasefire or negotiated settlement. The suggestion was met with bitter, despairing laughter. The admirals had all read the intelligence summaries of American public opinion. Pearl Harbor had enraged the American public in ways Japanese planners had catastrophically underestimated. The attack, intended to demoralize America into negotiating, had instead created absolute determination to see Japan destroyed completely. American war bonds were being oversubscribed. Factories were running 3 shifts, operating day and night. Women were entering the industrial workforce in unprecedented numbers, replacing men who were marching off to war. There would be no negotiated peace. America wanted unconditional surrender. Nothing less would satisfy the American public. Japan had not merely started a war, they had united a continental power against them with total resolve. The Doolittle raid and strategic disasters Admiral Yamaguchi pulled out another document that made the situation even bleaker. It was an analysis of the Doolittle raid from April 1942. 16 American B-25 bombers had been launched from the aircraft carrier Hornet in an operation that was supposed to be almost impossible, launching medium bombers from a carrier deck and flying them across the Pacific to bomb Tokyo itself. The physical damage was minimal. a few buildings destroyed, a handful of civilian casualties. Militarily insignificant. But strategically, the raid had been psychologically devastating to Japan. It shattered the myth of homeland invulnerability, the deeply ingrained belief that Japan was immune from air attack, that the home islands were sanctuaries protected by distance and naval power. The Doolittle raid proved that American carriers could approach Japan itself. It forced Japan to keep aircraft and combat troops in the home islands for defense, resources that were desperately needed elsewhere. Most critically, it had prompted the Japanese High Command to accelerate plans for the Midway operation. They wanted to extend their defensive perimeter further eastward to prevent any possibility of American bombers reaching Japan again. This decision to attack Midway had set in motion the catastrophic sequence of events that ended in defeat at the battle itself. The strategic failure of Pearl Harbor. The meeting turned to the fundamental question: what went wrong? The attack on Pearl Harbor had achieved its immediate tactical objectives. The American battleships were sunk or damaged. But strategically, it had been catastrophic. Admiral Chuichi Nagumo, who had commanded the carrier strike force at Pearl Harbor, offered his perspective. The attack had been designed to destroy American battleship power, giving Japan 6 months to consolidate its conquests before America could mount an effective response. The theory was elegant in its simplicity. After 6 months of defeats, American public opinion would force the government to negotiate. American democracy, the Japanese planners believed, was too fractious, too divided, too war-weary to sustain a prolonged conflict. This theory was revealed as catastrophically flawed on multiple levels. First, battleships had become obsolete almost before the ink was dry on the war plans. Carriers, not battleships, were the decisive weapon. By missing the American carriers at Pearl Harbor, Japan had left America's most important naval assets untouched and operational. Second, American public psychology had been completely misunderstood. The attack had not demoralized America. It had unified American opinion in ways that nothing else could have achieved. Americans across the country came together with a clarity of purpose that had been absent before December 7th. Isolationism evaporated. The debate about whether America should even enter the war ended in a single day. Third, Pearl Harbor had paradoxically given America the moral high ground internationally. The sneak attack, combined with Japanese diplomatic bungling, Japanese diplomats were supposed to deliver a declaration of war 30 minutes before the attack began, but due to decoding delays, the declaration arrived after the bombing started, made Pearl Harbor appear as a treacherous and dishonorable act. American propaganda labeled it a day of infamy, and that label stuck. Japan had handed America a perfect rallying cry. Fourth, and perhaps most critically, the attack had been too successful in one specific way. It looked like treachery. It unified international opinion against Japan, making it easier for America to build alliances and secure resources for the war effort. The inescapable mathematics of industrial power. The meeting examined alternative strategies that might have produced better outcomes? What if Japan had not attacked the United States at all? What if they had only attacked British and Dutch colonial possessions in Southeast Asia? Would America have entered the war immediately? The consensus was unclear. President Franklin Roosevelt clearly wanted to enter the war against Germany and Japan, but American public opinion in 1941 was deeply isolationist. Without Pearl Harbor, would Congress have declared war? Perhaps not immediately. Japan might have gained months or even years to consolidate its conquests in Southeast Asia without American opposition. Instead, Pearl Harbor had given Roosevelt exactly what he needed politically and American public demanding war. Another hypothetical. What if the Pearl Harbor attack had been more thorough? What if Nagumo had launched a third wave to destroy the fuel storage, repair facilities, and submarine base? Some officers had advocated for this at the time. Nagumo had refused, concerned about American counterattack and wanting to preserve his forces. In hindsight, this caution looked like a fatal error. Destroying those facilities might have delayed American Pacific operations by 6 months or more. 6 months that Japan desperately needed. But the admirals acknowledged an uncomfortable truth. Even a more thorough Pearl Harbor attack would not have changed the ultimate outcome. The fundamental problem was not tactical execution, it was strategic reality. Japan's economy was a fraction of America's size. Japan's industrial capacity was perhaps 1/10 of America's. Japan's oil production was essentially zero without imports. Japan's population was less than half of America's. In a protracted war of attrition, these disparities guaranteed defeat. No tactical victory, however brilliant, could overcome these fundamental imbalances. Yamamoto had understood this from the beginning. He had opposed war with the United States, arguing that Japan could not win a prolonged conflict. He had been overruled by army leaders and civilian government officials who believed American democracy was weak and decadent, that Americans lacked the will to fight a long war, that a quick series of victories would force American capitulation. Every one of these assumptions was proven catastrophically wrong. The oil crisis Captain Fuchida presented the most depressing analysis of all, the oil situation. Japan's entire strategic calculus had been built around securing oil from the Dutch East Indies. American embargoes had threatened to strangle Japan's economy and military. Seizing the Indonesian oil fields was meant to solve this problem, and Japan had succeeded in capturing those fields mostly intact. But victory created new problems. The oil had to be transported to Japan. Tankers had to make the journey through waters increasingly infested with American submarines. In January 1942, Japan had imported 400,000 tons of oil from the Indies. By August, imports had dropped to 250,000 tons. The trend was clear and accelerating downward. By 1943, submarine warfare might cut oil imports to levels insufficient to maintain military operations. Japan would have oil fields, but no way to get the oil home. They would be resource-rich, but strategically starving. The illusion of victory. The admirals discussed whether there was any realistic path to victory at this point. Perhaps If Japan could inflict enough casualties on American forces, make the cost of advancing so high that American public opinion turned against the war, this hope was systematically demolished by intelligence assessments. American casualty tolerance appeared much higher than Japanese planners had anticipated. The Bataan Death March and reports of Japanese treatment of prisoners had enraged American opinion, making the war personal in ways that transcended military calculations. Americans weren't calculating costs and benefits. They wanted revenge. They wanted total victory. Casualty lists that might have discouraged other nations seemed only to strengthen American resolve. Each setback, each loss, only hardened American determination. Conclusion: the war was lost. The meeting concluded with no recommendations, no decisions, just shared understanding of terrible truth. Japan had lost the war on December 7, 1941, the moment the bombs fell on Pearl Harbor. They just didn't know it yet. The admirals filed out slowly, returning to their duties, planning operations they knew couldn't succeed, fighting a war they knew was lost. They were experienced enough to understand that their analysis, however accurate, would mean nothing. The military government wasn't interested in reality. They were committed to fighting to the bitter end, regardless of the consequences. August 6, 1942, 2 months after Midway, 2 months before the American offensives would begin in earnest. The end was not yet visible, but for those with the courage to read the numbers, it was absolutely inevitable. Japan had awakened the sleeping giant exactly as Yamamoto had feared, and now Japan would spend the next 3 years discovering what happens when you unite an industrial superpower against you with total resolve. The war was lost. The only question remaining was how long it would take, and how much destruction would be inflicted before Japan accepted the inevitable.